Hello, how's everybody doing? David Brancaccio here. Let me just get you into the mood before I introduce the guest, who you already know who he is. Just a quick paragraph from the work in question. Sinatra with a cold is Picasso without paint, Ferrari without fuel, only worse. For the common cold robs Sinatra of that uninsurable jewel, his voice, cutting into the core of his confidence, and it affects not only his own psyche, but also seems to cause a kind of psychosomatic nasal drip within dozens of people who work for him, drink with him, love him, depend on him for their own welfare and stability. A Sinatra with a cold can, in a small way, send vibrations through the entertainment industry and beyond, as surely as a president of the United States, suddenly sick, can shake the national economy. These are the words of Gay Talese.
And very well read, David. Thank you so much for showing up tonight. You're an early morning man, gets up at 5 o'clock in the morning for NPR, and usually is working hard at 7 o'clock. And by this hour, usually sleeping with his first and only wife. Is that true?
That is true. She's right here. First and only.
And here we are. Okay.
So we do this podcast now with Esquire magazine. If you put into the podcast app or iTunes or Google Play, Esquire Classic, they have a big archive, 50,000 wonderful works. We get the author if possible. We talk, and we get a professional reader, an actor, to read long stretches, and then we muse. And so there's a moment as we're recording this podcast, Gay and I, just a few weeks ago, where there's a famous scene that we're going to get to in a second where Sinatra squares off with Harlan Ellison. And Vincent Piazza, he's the actor from Jersey Boys and from, he plays Lucky Luciano in Boardwalk Empire. He's reading wonderfully. He's reading the scene. I look over to Gay, and what's amazing is he's in the moment. He's back in 1966. He's seeing the scene unfurl in his mind. And then suddenly I sort of felt like I had a little connection with this crazy, almost barroom brawl all those years ago. Gay Talese, one of the greats, a central exponent of what many called the new journalism, along with the likes of Tom Wolfe, Truman Capote, Joan Didion. Over the years, he's published an armful of books. They're here. I checked before we walked in here. The Kingdom and the Power about the Times was very important to me. I think it got me on this track of journalism. Thy Neighbor's Wife was, I think, life-changing for you, given the hands-on journalism that your special one-on-one reportage there. Mr. Talese, thanks for coming out tonight. I appreciate it.
It was very easy. I was given a limousine the size of a yacht. They picked me up right at home. Drove here. It took us an hour, but it was pleasant. I slept half the way home.
It was perfect. You didn't beg for this Sinatra assignment?
I did not. This period in the middle 1960s, in terms of my own life, I'd worked at the New York Times from 1956 as a reporter until 1965. I was 33, I believe, late in 65. I had a one-year-old daughter. My wife had a job, fortunately, and still has a job, even more fortunately. And I had loved daily journalism. I loved working for the New York Times, but journalism is really a young woman's game. I mean, when you get to be 33, 34, it's almost like an athlete. Your energy, your capacity to do under great pressure articles that have to be cogent, accurate, and also brief and quick. I didn't mind the brief and quick when I was 22, 23, but when I got to be in my 30s, I wanted to spend more time with the people I was interviewing and have more space. Limitations in journalism are 800 words, 2,000 words at most. And I wanted to do 4,000 or 5,000 words, maybe 10,000 words. Some of the great magazines were, in those days, particularly the New Yorker. You'd sometimes see a two-part article by A.J. Liebling or Joseph Mitchell or some renowned nonfiction writer. I wanted to do something like that, but I wasn't going to be able to do it at the Times. But I also had to make a living. So the editor of Esquire in those days, meaning the 1960s, in the 60s, there was one great editor for a period of about 8 or 9 years. His name was Harold Hayes. Norman Mailer wrote for Harold Hayes. Tom Wolfe wrote for Harold Hayes. William F. Buckley. I mean, all of the nonfiction writers, and some of them fiction writers as well, in the case of Mailer and others, wanted to work for Esquire. It was one of the days of the big magazines. I mean, there must be some of you in the room that knew what those magazines looked like. They are not to be seen anymore. But in those days, Esquire was one of the big magazines in terms of visual appeal. It was a monthly, meaning you had a lot of time to think and write, unlike daily journalism. And I was lucky to go from the New York Times to a one-year contract with the editor of Esquire, the aforementioned Harold Hayes. There was actually a movie a year or two ago by his son, Tom Hayes, a documentary on Harold's career. Nora Ephron was one of the young writers at that, incidentally for him. And my deal was that I had to write 6 pieces for the same amount of money I was getting when I was on the New York Times. In those days, like $350. It sounds ridiculous now. You make more than that an hour if you're a psychiatrist. But in those days, you actually could get by. And I was getting by, but I needed an income. And the deal was I could pick 3 pieces, and the editor of Esquire, Harold Hayes, would pick 3 pieces. At that time, I hope I'm not going off subject so much, but I fell in love with journalism when I was young. And when I reached, as I told you, the age of 32, I wanted to leave it. But I left it thinking that I was leaving behind a great story. And the great story I thought I was leaving behind was the life and mind of journalists. I thought these people that I had been with for a whole decade, and one in the New York Times building, the center of the whole dynasty of Sulzbergers, on 229 West 43rd. There were within that building copy readers, obituary writers, famous editors, reporters of all kinds, crime reporters, art reporters, great critics. Brooks Atkinson was still alive then.
So that's what you wanted to write.
I wanted to write. I was a copy boy when I started. I remember when I'd go in at 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock, wait for Mr. Atkinson to return from the theater. My job, around 10, he would come back from the theater in those days and write his review, and then would appear in the next edition of the paper. It wasn't this layover for a couple of days. Mr. Atkinson would come in his dark suit and his fedora and go to his little room, and I would wait for Mr. Atkinson to finish his first page. And he wrote longhand, beautiful handwriting on yellow line pad, and he'd scribble line after line. And then he'd finish the first page and hand it to me. And I would take the first page down the hall. His room was in the art section was in the back, and it led down the hall. You go to the city room where the copy readers and editors were there waiting to edit Mr. Atkinson, though nobody did. But as I was carrying his yellow line pad, I'd read the review before anybody, and I'd be reading, and I think, how wonderful. This man is such a good writer, and not only a good writer, his penmanship is amazing. And they'd tend it right up to the print. They would make print of this. The linesmen, the metallic workers, would turn into print immediately from the handwriting. It's amazing. I thought, what a character. Many others. So when I got back to Esquire, I said to Harold Hayes, I want to write about some of these people. This is obituary writer, this crazy guy in the back of the room. He writes obituaries. Not only writes obituaries, he keeps looking in the newspaper for important people's illness. If someone has a sore throat or someone has a cold, Frank Sinatra has a cold, he's going to die. And he'd anticipate this. And I thought, what a ghoulish guy. Mr. Alden Whitman, he had a pipe and missing teeth because he was a Harvard student. He was a communist, and somebody broke his teeth in some fight over a political.
So they let you write that at Esquire?
Well, let me get to.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I'm holding you up. I'm sorry you're in charge of the show. I'm taking over. Look, I'll keep my mouth shut. Let me get this story out. We'll be done. So I wanted to write about Mr. Bad News. And Harold said, oh, you can do that. So that was my first piece under this 6-piece contract. Second piece, Harold Hayes said, we have an easy story for you. It's a cover. What's that? Frank Sinatra says, Harold, everybody has been doing Frank Sinatra there are thousands of articles. What can you say about Sinatra? It's not been written many times. And he's even he doesn't know anymore who he is. It's overdone. No, what's easy is that you'll get on the cover with this. You're not on the cover with Mr. Bad News or anybody else you want to write about. This is easy. Go out there. The press agent's waiting for you.
It's easy, he says.
Easy. You can go out there. We'll put you in the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. Nice weather out there in Beverly Hills. I had been there once before, and I knew it was nice to be out there. And Monday, go out there Sunday afternoon, have a nice steak and a martini at the hotel. Next morning, you see Frank. Great. So next morning, Monday morning, I called the press agent, Jim Mahoney. Hello, Mr. Mahoney. I'm Harold Hayes. Said you were expecting me, and I'm here now. I'm at the room 412 at the Beverly Wilshire. Oh, he said, well, bad news for you. What? Frank Sinatra has a cold. Oh, I said, well, a couple of days. I'll hang around. Well, a couple of days, maybe he'll be better, and we'll do it. Well, he said, I'm not so sure it's that simple. Frank Sinatra is also a little bit concerned about this piece now. I said, it was all set up. Harold told me it would be simple. No, we're worried. This Cronkite in New York we hear is looking into Frank's past and his so-called connection with organized crime figures. I said, listen, I'm not writing about that. Well, we want to be sure, and his lawyer, Mr. Rudin, would like to see this piece. Oh, wait a minute. We can't do that. I couldn't do it at the Times. I can't do it at Esquire. It's a deal breaker. Well, then maybe you ought to go home. I thought, right, oh, great, oh sure, I'm more than eager, get out of here. And I said, but I'm going to have to call the editor, tell him what you said. He said, go ahead. I called Harold Hayes. I said, these guys are, now, we can't do what they're proposing. Absolutely, we can't. So what do you want to do? I said, well, I can come home, or if you want me to, I can stay here and talk to other people, because I've been in this town before one other time, and I know some people. And I also, more important, know a restaurant owner named Jack Hansen, who's the owner, with his wife Sally Hansen, of the Daisy. Now, that means nothing in this room. But in the 1960s, anybody who was in Los Angeles will know that the Daisy was the most interesting restaurant supper club along Rodeo Drive in the middle of Beverly Hills. Interesting, good-looking waitresses, a very interesting cast of characters who went there. One of the young waitresses was O.J. Simpson's next wife. I mean, she was a waitress there. And every Hollywood person, every good-looking pole-dancing wife went there. And
So
Jack
you call over there? You called
Jack
over there?
Hansen
Yeah?
had all these phone numbers, and I'd met him before. So I said, Jack, I can't see Frank Sinatra, but you know some of these musicians who work for him, or maybe actresses who were in movies with him, or some band leaders. You know, he had a lot of phone numbers, as any restaurant owner in the show business town, of course, of Beverly Hills has them. So I started calling these people. Did this for the next maybe 3-4 days, including the tailor up the street, Dick Carroll, who made Sinatra's suits, and I got to know the measurements, Sinatra's cuffs, and the kind of colors he favored, the gifts he sent. Sinatra would go in Christmas time and choose gifts for people because he knew their particular their sizes. Amazing how. And I met a woman who was a maid with toupees for Frank Sinatra. Interviewed her. A lot of people like that, marginal characters in the world of show business. But interesting, because at one time or another, they had an interaction with Frank Sinatra, either as a musician in the orchestra behind Sinatra as a soloist, maybe lighting authorities, directors of movies, stars or minor stars that worked in musicals or whatever. So that's what I did. That's what I did. And I did that for the next 3 or 4 days, and that slowly evolved into this article about Sinatra without Sinatra. And that's not so hard to do if you really have a interest in ordinary people. And just to finish off, if you hope I do finish off, I will quickly do so. My background prepared me for this article and other articles like it, because my mother and father had a store. And anybody who happens to be a daughter or son of a storekeeper in this room knows that when you grow up with your parents as storekeepers, you learned early in life to be courteous to customers. You learn to get along with all kinds of people. You learn to be comfortable with strangers, because the customers initially are strangers until they become familiar with you. You learn about ordinary life. Nothing exalted about a store in most cases, but as a kid I grew up in stores. And as a journalist, I found my store upbringing most useful to me in being comfortable with all kinds of people. So when I'm dealing with Sinatra people, not really Sinatra people that are recognizable by name, but who had a kind of employment at one time or another, in one form or another, with Sinatra, I would look up those people and get their impressions of him. And that really, in composition, and it was the kind of prismatic approach to getting the glimmerings of different lights upon different stars, mainly the big star. All those voices and echoings and chorus of opinion is what I got in that piece, and that's about it.
Yeah, it becomes
a long question, wasn't it?
It's great. It becomes one of the greatest pieces of nonfiction journalism in our lifetimes, if not ever. And he doesn't even get the interview with Sinatra, but you got close. Tell me the story. Who tipped you off about when he was going to go to that lounge where you got close?
Nobody tipped me off. The question, who tipped me off about that lounge? He's talking about the Daisy. I told you I had met 2 years before this interesting couple, Jack and Sally Hansen. Now, if there were older people in this room, and I see none.
What could you say?
Well, in the 1960s, in women's fashion, there was a line of women's trousers, pants, called Jax, J-A-X. There was a store on 57th Street between Madison and 6th called Jax. It was on the north side of the street. The store in San Francisco called Jax. There's three stores in Southern California, Balboa, and two on Wilshire in L.A. In San Francisco, Jax. Chicago, there was a Jax. Jax was a big name then. The Jack was from Jack Hansen and his designer wife, Sally. So a couple of years before the Sinatra assignment, I was out there on another story. Didn't work out. It was on Natalie Wood. She was the big star then of Gypsy and West Side Story and the movies. But I did go out there and spend some time befriending Jack and Sally, who played tennis. I was then a very avid tennis player, and Jack had his own court. And so when I returned a couple of years later, I knew these people. The Daisy, I was having dinner one night when Sinatra had this long cold and I was getting the cold shoulder. I was having dinner with Sally Hansen in the back of the room of the Daisy. It was about 10 o'clock, 10:30. That's when I just saw, way out in the bar, under the lights of the bar, I said, "That's Frank Sinatra." And she says, "Yes, he comes here all the time." "Really?" I said, "And who's he with?" He said, "I don't know. A couple blondes." And who was a couple of his bodyguards in there. She knows there's Leo DeRocher. You remember, he used to be the manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers. "Oh, yes, I remember that. He was there." "And who's the other guy?" "Oh, that's Brad Dexter. He's the guy that saved Frank Sinatra when he almost drowned in Hawaii a year before." Well, so she's carrying. I said, "Holy God, I thought." And she said, "You don't want to go over and talk about it?" I said, "Of course not. I wouldn't want to. He is cold, and I don't want him to mess up this interview. Who knows? He may change his mind, won't talk to me." So I just watched him. That's the scene. And then what I noticed, someone put on the music, changed the music from a rock, whatever it was, to the Sinatra song in the wee small hours of the morning. And the young people were dancing, and the dance floor was in the middle. The restaurant was on one side, the dance floor here. On the other side was the bar. And beyond the bar, there was a large pool room. So I watched Sinatra drinking and described what I saw in the lead of this article. And then he got up, and then he walked toward the pool room, which I had been in this restaurant a couple times, so I knew what was there. When I saw him walking with a couple of his bodyguards, leaving the two blondes smoking and drinking alone at the bar, although one bodyguard remained with him, he walked and I left Sally and slowly made my way, with crowds around me, of course, toward the pool room. And I noticed Sinatra sat in one corner of the pool room, and I sat in another corner. There must have been 200 people playing on these two big pool tables. And some little guy he seemed to capture the eye of Sinatra. He was this little guy playing pool, dressed as I described in the piece, with these game warden boots. And for some reason, Sinatra sat there with a cigarette and fixated on these goddamn game warden boots. And then when Sinatra opened his mouth, there was silence. And even one of the guys playing pool stopped playing pool, and Sinatra said, "Hey, what kind of boots are they?" This little guy. Later I found his name was Harlan Ellison. He's a well-known. I didn't know anything about Harlan Ellison.
Speculative fiction. There's a whole section of Harlan Ellison over.
But I didn't know that. And this guy said, "There's Harlan Ellison. I don't know, man. Are they Spanish boots? I don't know, man. British boots?" "Hey, why are you talking to me?" "Because I don't like your boots." "Oh, I hate to shock you, but I dress the suit myself," says Harlan Ellison, something like that. And all the room was quiet. And finally, Sinatra got up from the stool, and in a slow way I describe in the piece, gets closer to Ellison, and he says in a funny little way, "Are you expecting a storm?" And everyone's looking around bewildered and sort of stunned, and Harlan didn't know how to answer this. "How can you answer this?" And Sinatra said, "What do you do?" Sinatra said, the other guy, Ellison, "I'm a plumber." And one of his friends, "Oh no, he's not a plumber, he's a screenwriter. He wrote the Oscar." "Oh yeah, Sinatra? Well, I've seen it, and it's a piece of shit. I used a piece of crap, and he's a piece of shit." "Oh," says Ellison, "that's funny. They haven't even released the film yet." "Yeah, but I still see it as a piece of shit." So this is it. So I'm now listening to this, not daring to make notes. Now, I don't make notes with a tape recorder. I've never in my whole life used it. But what I do is not only remember, not that I have total recall. Truman Capote said he had total recall in cold blood. Well, that's good, but I don't think anybody has total recall. But what I have are shirt boards. And I will show you here. Let me hold that for
I'm going to hold that for you. Show the shirt boards.
These are little cuts from what is, you know what a shirt board looks like, don't you?
The way shirts
Maybe
from
you
the
don't.
cleaner, right?
And I cut them up like this, and I always make my notes covertly if possible. When no one's looking, I'm in a men's room, and I'll write notes. So, "You're expecting a storm?" Oh, he wrote the Oscar." "No, I'm a plumber." All this stuff. I'm writing down in the bathroom after. And this thing goes on. Ridiculous scene, but interesting. And certainly unexpected and unscripted. After Sinatra left, I went to this man, Ellison. I gave him my name. He gave me his name. I said, "Do you mind if we meet tomorrow? Can you give me your address? I'd like to come over and talk to you about this evening." He said, "I want to go." "No, we'll do it tomorrow. All I wanted to just..." So he said, "Okay, come on." So the next day I drive over to see Harlan Ellison. He lived in Benedict Canyon somewhere. And I had an Esquire paid for rented car. And I went over and said, "Now last night, here's what I heard. But what were you also thinking?" I always ask people I'm interviewing, not what they said. I don't care what they said, because half the time what people said is what they mean anyway. That's why I don't use a tape recorder. I want third and fourth. When I'm interviewing people, seriously interview them, I'll ask them the same question 4 or 5 times. And then I go over the quote, I change the quote. I make them change the quote. We want to make it better, because a quote is boring. It takes up so much space, and people who use quotes are usually they're awful. Unless you have the people work on their own quotes, and you're really making them think better, speak better. And that's what I do. Maybe they don't teach us in journalism one-on-one, but I've always done this. So I'm working my head over Harlan Ellison and having him go through that evening with me and taking his impressions. Did Sinatra, do you think he's going to throw a drink at you? Did you think Sinatra's going to throw a punch at you? Blah, blah, blah. So that's how I got that scene. And then I continued what I was doing for a few weeks. And finally, the phone rings in the hotel. And it's the press agent, James Mahoney, mentioned earlier. He says, "I understand you're still in town." "Yeah, I am. I understand you're seeing some of Frank's friends." "I don't know if they're Frank's friends, but I'm seeing people. How's Frank's cold?" He says, "Well, not any too better, but he's gonna try to tape this NBC show called Frank Sinatra, Man and His Music. And if you behave yourself and you're not going to try to talk to him, you can go with me to the Burbank studio, Warner Brothers studio, tomorrow, and we can watch him rehearse. And there'll be a lot of people there, and you're with me. So stay with me." I thought, "Oh, sure, I will. I'll stay with you. I'll pick you up at 12:30 at the hotel." So he does. And the next day, the next afternoon, we're driven out to Burbank. It must have been 15 miles from Beverly Hills. And I'm in a big studio. A few hundred people were watching, mostly advertising guys from Budweiser, which is sponsoring the program, a lot of television people, a lot of beautiful women. And Sinatra is trying to rehearse. And after that, he tries to sing maybe 2 or 3 of the 18 songs of that for that program. That had to be 18 songs, I think it was. He sang the first 2 or 3 very beautifully, including Nancy. And then the third song, I forget what it was, but his voice cracked, and the whole scene, if you read the piece, is made up of just observing that, just like the Daisy was observation, just what it is reporting visually. I always think when I'm a reporter, even when I was a young reporter working on a daily newspaper, the New York Times, I wanted to be a storyteller. I wanted to be a reporter, but fundamentally a reporter who also told stories, but told real stories, not imaginary stories. I was reared reading great short story writers. For some reason, my Italian tailor father, I don't know where he got it, had in our apartment above the tailor shop. On the shelf, there was a Bible and a couple of encyclopedias, and there was one little short story book in English of the French writer named Guy de Maupassant. That's what I read when I was in high school. I loved those stories. And I got older and I read other short stories. I remember reading F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Winter Dreams, the greatest short story ever written, according to me. And I read Irwin Shaw. People, you have not heard of Irwin Shaw. People here, I'm telling you, when I grew up, he was a great short story writer. Girls in Their Summer Dresses, read that. I mean, or The 80-Yard Run, the best sports short story ever written. John O'Hara, for dialogue, I learned him. Carson McCullers once wrote a story I saw in the New Yorker called The Jockey. And when I became a sports writer, my first job with the Times, I interviewed a jockey and I tried to I had to steal from Carson McCullers how she described the jockey. I wanted to be, my first short stories, or my first articles, short story form in the New York Times, really based on my favorite short story writers. I wrote a story about caddies once for the New York Times Sunday magazine. It's based on Fitzgerald's story called Winter Dreams, which is about a caddy in Minnesota who falls in love with a young girl who's taking golfing lessons. All of this fiction it came infused within my repertorial drive, and I wanted to tell stories, but real names, verifiable information, no faking it, no taking liberties, no imagination, no room for imagination. It's all footwork, hard work, hanging out in the Daisy or hanging out somewhere. The art of hanging out is what it's all about.
Okay, you said to me when we were doing the podcast that you think you got a better sense of Sinatra because you didn't get the interview. Is that right?
Yeah, it could be true, because if you were interviewing people who are famous, they might be show business people or political people, they have answers, canned answers for everything. You're getting worn out stuff. But if you don't interview them, but you watch them, so much of their visual communication comes through. And if you talk to a lot of people who are in the shadows of famous people's lives, and they're always hangers-on, no matter who you are, and they all have recollections of moments with the big star. So it's very interesting to get past the star on the stage and get back with the spear carriers and get their impressions from the obscurity of the chorus on what it's like to be behind or around someone who is the center of the heaven. And so I didn't think, if I spoke to her, if Frank Sinatra said, "Hey, listen, Gay, my coal's over. I'm sorry I kept you waiting in the terrible old Beverly Wilshire Hotel for a week. Come on over. Let's have some pasta together." I wouldn't know what the hell to ask him. What do you ask Frank Sinatra, or Mick Jagger, or Madonna, or what do you ask any of them? I mean, what you want to do is hang around. And they're not going to let you hang around if they can avoid it. So you sort of do so on the edge, as I did. On the edge in the Warner Brothers studio, watching his voice crack and him getting pissed off at the director, Dwight Hemme, or not Dwight, yeah, it was Dwight Hemme, yeah. They had Harlan Ellison. Dwight Hemme was a big-time NBC director then, and I remember he got mad at Hemme during that time when the rehearsal was up and Harlan Ellison, and then I went to Las Vegas, because once I wrote a great piece many pieces for the New York Times on Floyd Patterson, who was the champion when I was a young sports reporter. And I really had 30 separate interviews with Floyd Patterson. Then I did a long piece in Esquire in 1962 on Floyd Patterson. I knew him, I owned him, he was my guy. So when he was fighting in Las Vegas in 66 against Muhammad Ali, I had, and Sinatra wouldn't talk to me. I thought, I'm going to go to Las Vegas, because Floyd Patterson, I'll give you I got 2 tickets for Floyd Patterson. And I flew to Las Vegas to watch the fight, and Floyd Patterson's handlers, I knew all of them. So I got a pretty good seat, close enough to watch Sinatra and those other people, Joey Bishop and Dean Martin and, the whole clan. They were there. And then I actually called Floyd before the fight and says, Floyd, see if you can put in a good word and get Frank to talk to me a little bit. After Floyd Patterson got knocked out by Ali in maybe a round or 2, I forget. It was a disastrous fight. Then there was a a day later, the press corps had a post interview with Floyd Patterson, battered old Floyd Patterson. He comes out, what a game thing to do. He can meet all the press and explain he couldn't hit Ali and whoever could, but and then he looked in he says, is Gay Talese here? God, I thought, he lost his Gay Talese. Yeah, here I am, Floyd. Did you ever get to Frank Sinatra?
He's worried about you, Gay. He's worried about
incredible. You. It's really true. Did you ever get to Frank Sinatra? No, thanks, Floyd, but take care of yourself.
We have some time for some questions here. Get some questions on this side of the room. Anybody? Yes, sir.
Was there a point during this interview process with Sinatra that you realized that not having access to him was more...
I'll repeat the question. The question he asked was there a point during this process of chasing down Frank Sinatra when I realized it's better not to chase him, it's better without him? Yeah, I think I knew that before the Floyd Patterson fight, but I kept, I kept the bait alive. Maybe I would. But I guess, but the full answer is what I cannot verify, and that is that I liked not talking to Frank Sinatra. And that wasn't exactly what I was about, but I also felt, not for the first time in my life as a professional journalist, I felt very comfortable writing about crowds and people in crowds. I like crowds. I like this crowd. I like being in crowds of people. I don't like being alone. I hate being alone because I have to write alone. The fun of my journalism life is research. The no fun is sitting there alone and trying to make sense of it and write it and get a sentence that goes past my head, because I'm always thinking, it could be better, it could be better. Look what Fitzgerald did. Look what Irwin Shaw did. Look what Carson McCullers, look at this opening of this short story. I always wanted to do that. And if you read my collections or if you read anything I write, whether it's a book or an article, they begin with scenes. I want to write. One time my wife, Nan, who I see here tonight, she edited a book of Francis Coppola's wife, Eleanor Coppola, about the making of Apocalypse Now. I think it's called Notes. And she's a close friend of Eleanor Coppola, and consequently I got to know Francis Coppola through Nan, not through my own initiative. One time, we were invited to California, Napa Valley, to spend some time and stay over with the Coppolas. And he was then doing a movie called Cooper. I think that's the car, isn't it, Cooper?
Yeah. Tucker?
Oh, Tucker. Thank you so much. Glad you showed up. What's your name? Tucker. No, this car, Tucker. There you were. And he'd say, let me show you how I put a film together. Fine. He had a whole trailer, and that's behind the house. And what he does is what I do. He does little cards, scene by scene by scene. But you see this, and then there's a draft of it, like if you have this book that's published by TASCHEN. It has my sketch of the Frank Sinatra, which is like a scenic little showboard. It's like a board, a showboard. I don't know what they call it. Storyboard.
Yeah.
I use that.
It's on that same cardboard, isn't it?
Yeah.
Bigger
Any
pieces.
other questions? this handsome guy.
Can you tell us about your reaction to how people responded to the piece, what you thought was first published?
Well, the question is, when the piece was first published, what reaction did I get? I tell you, I don't remember. I mean, I'm not supposed to say that now because there's a book for $200 that I'm supposed to try to sell. But I don't remember. I had a six-piece contract, which I didn't renew. The reason is I did these pieces. I did Frank Sinatra, and I followed with Joe DiMaggio. Then I followed with a piece on defense of Muhammad Ali, who was then banned from boxing because he wouldn't support the Vietnam War. And I did my Mr. Bad News piece, and I did another piece in that same year on Clifton Daniel, the managing editor at the New York Times. He was married to Harry Truman's daughter, Margaret. I'd worked for Clifton Daniel, of course. He was the managing editor when I was there. And I wanted to write about him. And when I did write about him for Esquire, all in this six-piece contract, I thought there's a story here. And what's the story? This managing editor was preceded by 15 other managing editors going back before the Civil War. And if I knew the story of those managing editors and the staff they had and the direction they led and the coverage of war and peace and war and cultural, the sinking of the Titanic and everything else, I have a book. So after I interviewed him, Daniel, and a lot of other people, I was really going back to the place I loved. I quit the New York Times, but then I went back and worked with the New York Times and doing the book that in 1969, 4 years later, would be The Kingdom of Power, which is the first time I made any money because it was a bestseller. But when I interviewed Daniel, I realized I wanted to know about Carl Van Anda, the managing editor when the Titanic sank. And I wanted to know about Jimmy James, who was the managing editor during World War I. And I wanted to know about Burchell, Mr. Burchell. These editors all had, their pictures are on the wall of the managing editor, Clifton Daniel. All these guys, and each of them is a chapter, or maybe more than a chapter. So then I did that, and I quit Esquire, and I spent 4 years. The reaction, you asked me the question, you didn't ask for that, but I'll give you the answer. The answer was, it was just another piece. When I was a young boy working in the tailor shop watching my father, he cared everything about every suit, every button, the lining, sewed it. And I grew up caring about everything I did, whether it was a caption for a picture I was writing, or a short piece for the sports department, or the news department, or interviewing some garbage collector. It didn't make any difference. I worked as well as I possibly could. Similarly, I get this six-piece contract in '66. I did every piece as well as I could. I didn't know what was bad, what was good. It was the best I could do. I knew that. So when the Esquire thing was published, I guess it got no more. I mean, I thought Mr. Bad News is better. If you ever have a chance to read Mr. Bad News, that really is close to a short story. And Mr. Alden Whitman is not famous. So the whole strength of that story is I'm writing about a not famous person and making that story from the first line to the last woven like fiction, but it's not a word of fiction in that piece. That is challenging for journalism. Sinatra, he's famous, and he carried me. I mean, I did a pretty good job, but never did I back in '66 think I'd be selling a book, the same damn piece, now $200 up. Incredible. If you pay for that, I don't know.
There's a question here, sir.
Yeah.
I have a two-part question. What was the reaction from Sinatra's camp? And did you ever meet him later?
What's the reaction from Sinatra's camp? Did I ever meet him later? No reaction, and no, I never met him. I mean, I don't want to do it. Celebrities don't write fan letters. I mean, I've interviewed the only celebrity I ever enjoyed writing about, the only one I loved the guy, was Peter O'Toole. During the research, that's the only time I enjoyed being with a superstar. Why? Because he was intellectually curious. He wasn't just a narcissist. He was really, and he reached out to me and to Nan. This was before 60. This was 63. He just done Lawrence of Arabia, and I went to London Esquire was doing a strike. In 1963, we had a big strike in New York, 3 months. So I had free time, and I was sent to London by Esquire. And I interviewed Peter O'Toole, and he said, I can't talk to you in London. We have to go to Ireland. You want to go? Sure. So I go to Dublin with Peter O'Toole, hang around bars, and he just loves to hear his voice. And not only does he love, he's a lyrical man, and he also was interested in me. He said, how do you make a living doing this? I said, well, he said, how old are you? Yeah, you have a wife? Yeah, in fact, my wife, her father from Ireland, her name is, Ahern. Oh, really? You have any children? No, I don't have any children, Peter. Why? I can't afford it. I can't afford a child. She's got a job. We can't afford. Oh, you know what's wrong with you? What? You're not a risk taker. You're afraid. And I think, this goddamn O'Toole, Mr. Lawrence of Arabia, is saying, I don't have any cojones. I don't have any... And look, he had a child himself, a 3-year-old daughter at the time. And I thought about that. And then he said, you know what? Where is your wife? She works in New York. Why don't you ever come over? Where? London. You can stay with us for a while. Are you kidding? No, we have a guest room. I can't believe this. So I go back, after we got back from Dublin, and I was just continuing the interview and then writing the article. I called Nan. I said, Mr. O'Toole and his wife, Sean Phillips, is another actress, a famous Welsh actress, I think. They said, you can come over and we spend a few days here. She did. And you know what happened? This was 63. In that guest room we conceived our first daughter.
Wow, we have a question over here. Yeah.
Way in the back.
First her in the middle, then in the back, yeah.
A lot of times journalists use their own quest for access as part of the story, but you didn't do that. Why did you choose to leave yourself out of it?
What did you ask? Why did I leave myself out of the story?
Yeah, like when Mike Sager wrote about Marlon Brando, he used his own,
Oh, I remember that story. The Truman Capote story. The question is, why did I put myself in? There are times you don't belong. There are times you do belong. In the Sinatra piece, there's one scene where I do have first-person singular, and that is in Jilly's Saloon, which used to be on 52nd Street. And I walked in one night, not talking to Sinatra, but walking into a room where Sinatra was in the back of the bar in this favorite saloon, which is Jilly Rizzo, mentioned, as you know, in the piece. And I just observed, but I was then observing what I saw myself. There are other times when I do use first-person singular. For example, I wrote a piece for the New York Times on the front page this year, on March. It was about Selma, Alabama. I went 50 years ago, when I was a young guy, to cover the Selma March of '65. One of the reporters, not the only reporter, but one of the reporters. And I wrote about it, third person, not first person. I went back 25 years later, followed up the story. Now I'm 83 years old, and I go to the editor and say, listen, I want to do 50. I'm still alive, so let me go down there. So they said, fine. Now I went down this time. On the front page of the New York Times, it's first person. I'm not saying you have to look it up, but if you want to look it up, it was published March 7th, 2015. Yeah. You'll see first person. Why? Because as I told you, most exemplified by the Sinatra research, I like to write about the point of view of rather obscure people. That piece in Selma, page 1, this year, begins and tells the story through a landscaper with dirty hands and a fork, putting shrubs along the pathway of the main street of Selma 2 days before the arrival of President Obama, and who would lead the march toward the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which was the center 50 years ago of Bloody Sunday, which I saw and smelled the gas from. Now, 50 years later, I see this guy just scraping weeds and putting plants in the sidewalks on the side. And I thought, that guy is my lead. I talked to him. I introduced myself to him. I'm just an African-American, about 60-something. And I said, I was here 50 years ago. Oh, yeah, so was I. You were too? Yeah. I was 9. Oh. I wasn't here then because my mother wouldn't let me go downtown. We lived in the black ghetto back there near the chapel church. Oh yeah. But my sister came here, he said, and she got gassed. My little 15-year-old sister got gassed, and she was running back to where we lived. And the sheriff's posse, Sheriff Jim Clark's posse, was chasing us all the way back there. And you know what? I said, what? He said, I had a BB gun. I went up in my little living quarters from the window, and I was shooting this BB gun at the asses of the sheriff posse's horses. And one of those sheriff posse, hey, who's that nigger there with a shooting at? I said, he said that to you? Yeah, who's that nigger? Who's those nigger kids? I write that in my notes. I sent that in this article back to the New York Times. The New York Times currently has an executive editor who was African American. And the editor I work with said, hey, we can't get that in the New York Times. But I said, well, show it. Anyway, show it to the executive editor. Dean, what the hell's his name? Dean, what's the editor's name?
McKay.
Dean McKay, right. Thanks. And Dean McKay says, let it in. So there you have, front page New York Times, nigger, first person. So, but it worked there. There are times it works, sometimes it doesn't work. It's all up to what the situation is.
Glad you asked that question. There was a nice, so we'll go one back from that questioner, yeah?
I wonder, the people that you interviewed who intimately worked with Sinatra, his toupee, his suit maker, were they forthcoming? Didn't they worry about the repercussions of talking to you?
Some people, the question is, when you're talking to people who work for Sinatra or depend on Sinatra in some way, as that paragraph that David read indicates, aren't they reluctant to talk to you? You caution they might lose their job. That's true. It's how you talk to them. First of all, I don't want to sound more vain than I appear, but I do have a way of talking to people, which I learned from the store, that both instills confidence to talk to me, but also with a reassurance, which I've never violated in more than 50 years, of never violating a confidence. I do agree that there are times when people take risks when they give you their opinion. And sometimes I don't get what I want, which is their candor. But more often than not, I do. But even when I do, I'm careful. There's a way to phrase things. I mean, just give you an example, changing the subject momentarily. I wrote a book about the New York Times, as we mentioned before, The Kingdom of Power. The New York Times family, then and now, is owned by the Sulzberger family, going for 4 generations. When I worked for the paper, the top publisher was Arthur Hayes Sulzberger. He's the grandfather of the present publisher, Arthur Ox Sulzberger Jr. Mr. Arthur Hayes Sulzberger was a handsome man, married to Ephigene Ox, whose father, Adolph Ox, really is responsible for the grandeur of the Times, not the Sulzberger. They married into the Ox family. Mr. Arthur Hayes Sulzberger married Ephigene. Even though he was married to Queen Victoria of the New York Times, he was a great philanderer. He was the greatest. He looked like a guy in a matinee idol out of a Valentino character, but he had more girlfriends. Not only did he have girlfriends, he had an executive suite in the boudoir on the 14th floor, and he sometimes slipped these people in and out of that building in front of the elevator. He was very dangerous in the way he lived. Well, when I was writing The Kingdom of Power, I wanted to sort of reflect some of the bravado and courtly indiscretion of this gent who was the top guy, Arthur Sulzberger. When I interviewed him, he was then ill. He lived with a nurse around him. He was still technically the publisher, but he was actually in retirement. His son, Arthur, there was another man was running the business. And the nurse came in to this Fifth Avenue apartment overlooking the museum in Central Park. She brought him a pill. She's beautiful, white shoes and slender figure and blonde. And I saw this old guy, I'm interviewing him, and she comes over with a pill. And I saw this old guy look at this woman that he'd hired. No doubt he had impure thoughts, as Carter would put it. And then she walks away, if she gives him a pill, she walks down that long hall. This old guy's eyes are watching her all the way down there. In that book I wrote, to reflect that, I said that I described a scene, and then the girl arriving, the nurse arriving, I described him as having an eye for an ankle, little phrase, an eye for an ankle. It says it all. You don't have to be crude about this, but you can be also not lyrical, but graceful at least. And that's how you get things you want to say said well.
I just got the high sign. We're not finishing, but we're going to finish this part of the discussion. None of us is running out of here. Big round of applause for Gay Talese.